For the longest time, we've been told that depression and anxiety are caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, and that antidepressants can correct those imbalances and make you a happy individual. What if I were to tell you that you've been lied about what causes depression and anxiety for a variety of reasons, which includes fraud from greedy pharmaceutical companies and a status quo that wants you to stay disconnected from your true needs as a human being? They want you to adapt to their version of true happiness, which goes against those very needs that truly makes you happy and healthy. This is what Johann Hari finds out in his book Lost Connections while he tries to uncover the real causes of depression and anxiety. This book includes testimony and research from prominent experts in the field. Here are the 9 causes of depression and anxiety according to Johann Hari. Let's dive in deeper and unravel all the secrets of the real causes of depression and anxiety. I have to make a disclaimer. I'm not a qualified scientist or mental health professional. If you're currently suffering from depression or anxiety, I urge you to do your own research and to seek help from a qualified mental health professional. If you're currently on SSRI medication, please don't throw away your medication and talk to your doctor about your treatment plan. And if you want to stop your medication, please heed their advice in regards to tapering off your medication. Irving Kirsch is a leading researcher in placebo effects from Harvard Medical School. Kirsch discovered that drug companies were lying about the most common antidepressants that are being given out today, SSRIs. He made this discovery after an experiment he did to study the placebo effect in an SSRI medication. This experiment had 3 groups. The first group were told that they're getting a powerful antidepressant but received a sugar pill, placebo. The second group was given a powerful antidepressant. The third group wasn't given anything and was just followed. All 3 groups had a follow-up after a few months. The results showed that there were recoveries across all these groups. 25% of the recoveries were due to natural recovery, 25% because of the actual chemicals, and 50% of the recoveries occurred because of the story that was told to them. These were the people in the placebo group and the experiment. Kirsch wrote the book The Emperor's New Drugs, where he elaborated on this. After his book was published, Kirsch received an email from another scientist. The scientist claimed that more than 80% of the published studies on SSRIs were biased. Kirsch decided to investigate these claims through the Freedom of Information Act. Kirsch received information on 47 randomized placebo-controlled trials on 5 different SSRIs through his FOIA request. FDA reviewers wanted a completion rate of 70% or better for these 6-week trials. Only 4 of these 47 trials met that criterion. In one Prozac study with 245 participants, results were submitted to the FDA with only 27 participants. These 27 participants were the ones for whom Prozac worked. The results of the study stated that antidepressants resulted in improvement of symptoms of up to 1.8 points in the Hamilton scale, which is statistically significant. The Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, also called the HDRS, is used to determine improvements in symptoms. It is a 51-point scale, with 0 being happy and 51 being suicidal. To put things into context, good sleep results in a 6-point improvement in symptoms. In other words, in this study, Prozac was less effective than a good night of sleep. Johann then moves on to talk about another antidepressant, Paxil, which was released by the pharmaceutical company GSK. GSK lied about the results of one clinical trial on Paxil that proved that it was not safe for children because it caused children to have a higher incidence of suicidal ideation. An internal document advised GSK staff to withhold these findings because it would be commercially unacceptable to include a statement that efficacy had not been demonstrated, as this would undermine the profile of paroxetine. Paxil was banned by Britain's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority, also called the MHRA, the FDA in the US, and eventually other healthcare authorities around the world because it was found that episodes of suicidal behavior were between 1.5 and 3.2 times higher in children taking the drug than in those receiving a placebo. Eliot Spitzer, who was the former governor of New York, sued GSK for fraud, and GSK were fined $3 billion for the scandal. In 2016, a meta-analysis was published on one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, The Lancet. This meta-analysis looked at 34 trials on 14 different antidepressants, which included a total of 5,260 participants. Here are the findings of this meta-analysis. When considering the risk-benefit profile of antidepressants in the acute treatment of major depressive disorder, these drugs do not seem to offer a clear advantage for children and adolescents. The second chapter is titled Imbalance and deals with the serotonin hypothesis. The serotonin hypothesis basically states that lower levels of serotonin in your brain was responsible for depression, and it could be corrected with antidepressants. Johann interviews several psychiatrists, scientists, and psychologists to see what they had to say about this hypothesis. David Healy is a scientist who studies the effects of antidepressants. He said that there was never any basis for it. It did not ever get credited. There wasn't ever a point in time when 50% of the field actually believed it. Professor Moncrieff is a British psychiatrist and professor of critical and social psychiatry at University College London. She said, "We don't know what a chemically balanced brain would look like. People are told that drugs like antidepressants restore a natural balance to your brain. But that is not true. They create an artificial state. The whole idea of mental distress being caused simply by a chemical imbalance is a myth." John Ioannidis is a Greek-American physician scientist, writer, and Stanford University professor who has made contributions to evidence-based medicine, epidemiology, and clinical research. He is the director of the Stanford Prevention Research Center and co-director of the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford. This is what he had to say. "The companies are running their own trials on their own products. They're involving all these poor researchers who have no other source of funding and have little control over how the results will be written or presented. Typically, it's the company people who write up the scientific report instead of the researchers themselves." Johann then points out that this evidence goes to the regulators who decide whether a drug is safe enough to be introduced in the market. 40% of the regulators' wages are paid by drug companies, and this percentage jumps to 100% in Britain. The rules have made it easy for drug companies to push their drugs onto the public. As Ioannidis puts it, "This field is sick, bow, and corrupted, and I cannot describe it otherwise." This chapter concludes with quotes from Dr. Irvin Hirsch from Chapter 1, where he mentions evidence of serious side effects like increase in suicide risk in young people, increase in the risk of violent criminal behavior, increased risk of death from all causes in older people, rise in type 2 diabetes in everyone, rise in the risk of miscarriage in pregnant women, and increased chances of giving birth to a child with autism or physical deformities. About 20% of people suffer from serious withdrawal symptoms when they stop. The book then introduces Peter Kramer, who is a proponent of SSRIs, who started taking apart Kirsch's studies in public. Kramer's first argument was that Irving is not giving SSRIs enough time to act. The clinical trials he analyzed typically last for 4 to 8 weeks, but that is not enough time for the drugs to take effect. Irving analyzes and tries to find longer clinical trials and found 2. In the first trial, the drug had the same effect as the placebo, and in the second trial, the placebo did better. Kramer's second argument was that the trials that Irving analyzed tend to lump together two groups, moderately depressed individuals and severely depressed individuals. Maybe the drug doesn't work for moderately depressed individuals, but it does work for severely depressed ones. This leads to dilution of the effects and the results. Irving returns to the data and finds that except for one study, all the studies involved severely depressed individuals. In 2012, Peter Kramer went to observe some clinical trials. He found that the companies faced a major problem. He discovered that the companies found it difficult to find volunteers who would take potentially dangerous drugs, and the companies were restricted by law to pay volunteers a small compensation for this immense risk, which amounted to about $40 to $75. Kramer noticed that this led to a lot of desperate people turning up who would get food, therapy, and money that could double their poverty level income. The people had a strong incentive to pretend to have a condition they happened to be studying there, and the drug companies have a strong incentive to believe them. Because of this reason, Kramer concluded that the data on antidepressants from all these clinical trials was meaningless and said that Irving Hirsch was building his conclusions from low-quality, fraudulent data. Johann interviewed Peter Kramer and asked him, is this not a case against the drugs then? He said that when he asked Kramer this question, Kramer became irritable and said, even bad trials can yield usable results. I think I want to cut off this conversation now. During the interview, Kramer also issued a word of caution. He recommended prescribing antidepressants for 6 to 20 weeks, and beyond that, he said, I think that the evidence is thinner, and my dedication to the argument is less as you get to long-term use. I mean, does anyone really know what 14 years of use does in terms of harm and benefit? I think the answer is we don't really know. This chapter talks about an important study by two researchers in the 80s that changed the way we view depression. These two researchers were George Brown, a medical sociologist, and Tyrrell Harris, who was a psychiatrist. Prior to the study, the prevailing view was split between two groups. The first group consisted of Freudians who believed that the distress in their patients could only be found in their personal lives, and especially in their childhoods, and required one-on-one therapy with deep diving into the unconscious. The second group consisted of psychiatrists who believed that depression was a chemical imbalance that could only be fixed with pills. Both groups would then find a middle ground stating that depression could either be reactive or endogenous. Reactive depression was caused by a natural reaction to unfortunate circumstances, while endogenous depression, on the other hand, was believed to be caused because of chemical imbalances in the brain. For the most part, the prevailing view was that depression was endogenous. Brown noticed that very little data had been collected and that theories were being formulated in the dark with either personal anecdotes or abstract theories. Brown teamed up with Tyrrell Harris and started a longitudinal study in his hometown of Camberwell, which was a working class neighborhood that was falling apart. Two of them partnered with a local psychiatric clinic where they would recruit participants. They recruited a total of 228 participants who were all women and split them into two groups. The first group consisted of women who were diagnosed by psychiatrists with depression, and the second group consisted of non-depressed women. Both these groups of women had the same income levels. The researchers would conduct in-depth interviews with these women. The first thing they wanted to know was whether these women had experienced severe negative events in the year before they became depressed. They then started identifying factors causing depression and distress. This is where they came up with an emergent hypothesis. The more difficulties you had in life and the fewer stabilizers you had, the more likely you were to become depressed. Difficulties were defined as ongoing problems like the loss of a job, death of loved ones, marriage problems, health problems, etc., while stabilizers were described as factors in a person's life that help them deal with these difficulties. Amongst women who did develop depression, 68% had significant difficulties in the year before. Depressed women were 3 times more likely to be facing long-term stressors compared to the control group. Positive stabilizers reduce these stressors and decrease the chances of developing depression. These stabilizers would include good friends, supportive romantic partners, etc. They found that the two main factors of depression were severe negative events and long-term stressors. When these factors were combined in a participant, the chances of developing depression skyrocket. For instance, if you didn't have any friends or a supportive partner, or in other words, you're dealing with this on your own, the chances of developing depression from a significant life event jumped to 75%. Each negative individual factor tended to make things worse. People living in poverty also had higher chances of developing depression. The researchers concluded that clinical depression is an understandable response to adversity. The factors and techniques in the study were replicated by social scientists in countries everywhere from Spain to Zimbabwe with similar results. The study checked out. For example, in war-torn Zimbabwe, women who couldn't bear children were excommunicated or alienated by the village. Whereas in Camberwell, a bad reference letter from a past employer meant that no other employer would hire you. The problems seem different in Camberwell and Zimbabwe, but they have two broad features: economic strife and alienation from the community. The research was published in 1978 and led to the biopsychosocial model, which states that depression and anxiety can be caused due to three main causes: biological, psychological, and social factors, as opposed to the status quo that existed at the time that basically stated that depression was caused due to chemical imbalances in the brain. This is where we can say that the book actually begins and Johann starts to uncover and expand upon all the 9 causes of depression and anxiety. A Gallup poll was conducted between 2011 and 2012 across 142 countries. Millions of people were interviewed for this poll. This poll found that only 13% of the respondents reported being engaged in their work, which means that they were enthusiastic about and committed to their work and their organization. 24% of the respondents were actively disengaged, meaning that not only were they unhappy at work, but they were also actively engaged in undermining their colleagues. A recent survey has confirmed that the 9 to 5 is indeed a relic of the past, Johann says, and gives some statistics to back up his claims. Like the fact that 1 in 3 British workers check their email before 6:30 in the morning, gets to work at 8:18 a.m. and leaves the office at 7:19 in the evening. And the fact that 80% of British employers think it is acceptable to phone employees outside of work hours. Johann begins to wonder if this burnout is causing a rise in depression and anxiety. A common symptom of depression, he says, is derealization, which is where you feel like nothing you are doing is real or authentic. He posits that this is a natural reaction to working an unsatisfactory job just to pay the bills. He begins to look for scientific evidence to see if there's a link between depression, anxiety, and burnout. This is where Michael Marmot comes in. Sir Michael Marmot is a professor of epidemiology and public health at University College London. Marmot has led research groups on health inequalities for over 30 years, working for various international and governmental bodies, and this included a position where he was the head of commission on social determinants of health at the WHO. While Professor Marmot was a trainee in an outpatient clinic in Australia in the 60s, he started to see that in many cases depression was related to life circumstances for most individuals that visited the clinic, and said, yet people would come in with their problems and we would treat them with a bottle of white mixture. Marmot believed that a lot more of the problems they were seeing, like men who complained of mysterious stomach aches that appeared to have no cause, were similarly caused by the stress of the lives they were forced to live. Marmot would walk around the hospital wards and think that all the sickness and distress must tell us something about our society and what we are doing wrong. Marmot told doctors that we should be paying attention to the causes of a patient's depression. The doctors were incredulous and thought psychological distress couldn't cause physical illness. This belief has now been disproven, by the way. In the 70s, Marmot went to London and researched the health of British civil servants with the research question, how does your work affect your health? Marmot's reasons for picking civil servants was because you can't investigate this by comparing other jobs. A construction worker will have different stress and problems than a nurse or a teacher or an accountant. British civil servants were divided into grades, which determined their pay, responsibilities, and position in the hierarchy. Marmot studied the differences in health in people in different grades, which included 18,000 civil servants over a couple of years. Marmot found that people at the top of the civil service were 4 times less likely to have a heart attack than those at the bottom of the ladder. He also found that as your position rose, your chances of developing depression decreased. This chapter includes experiments and studies from 4 different scientists on the effects of loneliness on depression. Sheldon Cohen is a professor of psychology at Carnegie Mellon University and director of the Laboratory for the Study of Stress, Immunity, and Disease, and an adjunct professor of psychiatry and pathology at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He conducted an experiment where participants were exposed to a cold virus to measure the differences between how many friends and healthy connections they reported, and how likely they would be to contract the virus. He found that isolated people were 3 times more likely to contract the virus. Next up, we have Lisa Berkman, who is a professor of public policy, epidemiology, and global health at Harvard T.A. Chan School of Public Health. She conducted a longitudinal study over 9 years and found that isolated people are 200% to 300% more likely to die from several diseases like cancer, heart disease, and respiratory problems. John Cacioppo was a distinguished service professor at the University of Chicago. He founded the University of Chicago Center for Cognitive and Social Neuroscience. He also co-founded the field of social neuroscience. Here are 4 of Cacioppo's experiments and studies that were mentioned in Lost Connections. The first experiment included 100 participants who were told to wear a beeper with a heart rate monitor that went off 9 times during the day. Participants were told to write down how lonely or connected they felt and how to measure their heart rate in the heart rate monitor and write it down in a journal. On day 2, they would repeat the same process but had to spit in a tube and seal it and hand it over to the lab. The results showed that when a participant responded feeling lonely, the cortisol levels in their saliva were comparable to being physically punched. This experiment showed that depression not only hurts mentally, but physically as well. In the second experiment, 135 Participants who identified as reporting highly lonely were selected and took an extensive personality test. The results of the test revealed that lonely people had low self-esteem and pessimism and were afraid of being disliked by other people. The experimental group was split into groups A and B. Group A was led to remember times when they felt lonely under hypnosis from a qualified psychotherapist. Group B was led to remember the opposite, which is times where they felt socially connected. The results showed that Group A felt more depressed while Group B felt less depressed. The researchers concluded that loneliness leads to depression. This finding is super important because up until this experiment was conducted, it was believed that depression causes loneliness, not the other way around. The third study was a longitudinal study on 229 older Americans. 112 were male, 112 were female, one-third were white, one-third were black, and one-third were Latino. The results showed that loneliness preceded depression or depressive symptoms. Chances of developing depressive symptoms increased by 800% when a participant reported feeling lonely 50% of the time to 65% of the time. In this experiment, participants were selected based on whether they were found to be lonely or socially connected and split into two groups. Group A consisted of lonely individuals, while Group B consisted of socially connected individuals. Participants were hooked up to an EEG machine and shown images that were socially threatening or socially non-threatening. Cacioppo found that lonely people reacted to socially threatening images 55% faster than socially connected individuals. He concluded that you become hypervigilant when you are lonely, are more likely to take offense when none was intended, become afraid of strangers, begin to fear what you need the most. This can be reversed, but to help a depressed or severely anxious person, then they need more love and reassurance than they would have needed in the first place. Unfortunately, these people receive less love as they become harder to be around. Instead, they receive judgment and criticism, which accelerates the snowball effect. Cacioppo wondered why would loneliness cause depression and anxiety and why loneliness makes us hypervigilant. He teamed up with anthropologists to answer these questions and came upon some interesting ideas. Most anthropologists believed having a complex social structure and living in tribes helped humans to survive and thrive. In other words, it was biologically adaptive. Humans were able to hunt down big game and protect themselves from massive predators when they banded together. For example, people in your tribe would take turns throughout the night to keep the fire burning and keep watch against predators. This is a hypothesis for micro-awakenings, or the phenomenon that causes many of us to briefly wake up in the middle of the night. Now, if for some reason you were separated from your tribe, you'd be scared. You would have to be more vigilant at night to keep yourself safe from predators. This could be a reason, Cacioppo thought, that causes lonely people to be hypervigilant. Cacioppo decided to test out his hypothesis and discovered a community of the Amish in North and South Dakota that had a much lower incidence of mental health problems. These people were the Hutterites. The Hutterites are very religious and community-oriented people, and it's hypothesized that this is the reason why incidences of mental health illness is lower in their community. Cacioppo found that the Hutterites also had a significantly lower incidence of micro-awakenings compared to the average population. Cacioppo had some interesting things to say based on what he learned from his research. Here are some of his quotes. Humans are primed to live in a tribe. Loneliness could be evolution's way of signaling extra alertness because of the high cortisol levels detected in the experiment. People had an evolutionary incentive to treat people well or face being alone. A strong impulse in favor for survival. Loneliness motivates us to reconnect. To end loneliness, you need other people as well as a feeling that you're sharing something with the other person or with the group that is meaningful to the both of you, and you need to have a sense of mutual aid and protection. The modern world is at odds with our natural needs and instincts. But the strange thing is, modern society is completely at odds with our evolutionary instincts and needs. We've become so accustomed to doing things alone that we've started to believe that this is the natural state of the human being. Even the self-help industry bombards us with these messages of only you can help yourself, when evolutionarily speaking, we are hardwired to seek out comfort and help from our tribe. Robert Putnam is a professor of public policy at Harvard who is famous for his book Bowling Alone, which argues that the US has undergone an unprecedented collapse in civic, social, and political life since the 1960s, and that has serious consequences. Here are some things Putnam found. By 1985 to 1994, community involvement in community organizations fell by 45%. These trends have accelerated. When people were asked how many close confidants do you have who are not family, the average answer in the 80s was 3. In 2004, the most common answer was 0. This does not mean people are turning to their family instead, but family together time has been dropping as well. Materialism is the KFC of the soul. This chapter talks about how an excessive fixation on materialism makes people more depressed. Tim Kasser is an American psychologist who has authored over 120 scientific articles and book chapters on materialism, values, goals, well-being, and environmental sustainability, among other topics. Kasser came up with a system to measure the values people hold and how much they value materialism. He did this through something called the aspiration index. The index would measure this with questions such as, it is important to have expensive possessions, and it is important to make the world a better place for others. Through his research, he would go on to see if there is a correlation between people's values and the incidence of depression and anxiety. Kasser's first study. Kasser gave a questionnaire based on the aspiration index to 316 students and found that students who scored high on materialistic values had significantly higher levels of depression and anxiety. Kasser's second study. In his second study, Kasser gets a clinical psychologist to assess 140 18-year-olds in depth to see where they ranked on the aspiration index and if they were depressed or anxious, and the results were the same as the first study. The students who scored high for materialism also had significantly higher levels of depression and anxiety. Kasser's third study. Kasser wondered whether this was something that only happened to young people. So he designed a third study where 100 participants who belonged to different socioeconomic backgrounds and different age groups were selected from upstate New York. The results were the same. That is, people who are more materialistic were more likely to have depression or anxiety. Kasser's fourth study. Kasser wondered what explained this correlation, so he proceeded to conduct another study to find answers. In this study, 192 students were told to maintain a mood diary. The participants were told to write down to what extent they were experiencing 9 different emotions and 9 different physical sensations twice a day. The results showed that highly materialistic students not only felt more depressed, but also were more likely to feel sick physically. Kasser said, something about a strong desire for materialistic pursuits affected the participants' day-to-day lives and decreased the quality of their daily experience. This is where I'll segue into the concept of extrinsic and intrinsic motives. Intrinsic motives are things you do for the sake of doing them. For example, You work out because you enjoy it. Extrinsic motives are things you do because you will get something out of it, like money, sex, or a higher status. These rival sets of values exist in all of us. Kasser wondered whether this could explain his findings about why materialistic individuals tend to be more depressed and anxious, so he did another study. 100 participants were studied in detail over time in regards to their goals. Kasser classified these goals as extrinsic or intrinsic. He wanted to study if achieving extrinsic goals makes you happy and how does that compare to achieving intrinsic goals. The results showed that achieving extrinsic goals does not lead to an increase in happiness. For instance, a new promotion, buying a new car, jewelry, or new iPhone led to no increase in the level of happiness. On the flip side, achievement of intrinsic goals led to increasing levels of happiness. Examples of these goals could include things like being a better dad or friend or helping another person or dancing for the sheer joy of it. 22 different studies found the same results. Johann says that despite these facts, we chase extrinsic goals and pleasures because our culture today promotes these values and compels us to become more materialistic through advertising trends like lifestyle marketing. Tim Kasser calls these values junk values because just like junk food, these values give us short-term pleasure at the cost of our long-term health. 4 reasons why junk values are making us sick. During his interview with the author, Kasser believed there were 4 reasons why junk values were making us sick. Kasser found that materialistic people tend to have shorter and poor quality relationships. He said, if you value people for how they look or how they impress other people, it's easy to see that you'll be happy to dump them if someone better looking or more impressive comes along. It's also easy to see why other people are likely to do the same to them. Do you ever have those experiences where you are so immersed in what you're doing and enjoying it that you lose track of time? You could be experiencing a flow state. This is a psychological state where you feel fully immersed on a particular task in such a way that it energizes you and makes you happier. Highly materialistic people or people with junk values have been found to experience fewer frequencies of flow states. One of the reasons for this could be because they're more likely to be driven by extrinsic factors to seek pleasure, and that motivating factor could be a source of anxiety, compared to someone who does an activity purely for the sake of it, or in other words, because he's intrinsically motivated to do it. For instance, let's say there are 2 people who play the piano. Person A plays the piano just for the sake of it because he enjoys it and feels his ego dissolve. Person B, on the other hand, plays the piano because he wants to be the best pianist in the world. He often becomes self-critical when he makes mistakes. Highly materialistic people keep wondering how they're being judged by others, that is, they're status conscious. They're focused on how they're being perceived. They worry about what other people think about them and what praises they might get. Tim Kasser says, that's a heavy load to bear. Instead of doing what it is you are interested in doing or being with people who love you for who you are. If your self-esteem and sense of self-worth are contingent upon how much money you have or what your clothes look like or how big your house is, it forces you into a state of constant comparison. If you're the richest person in the world, there's always someone who has more money and things than you. Materialism leaves you at the mercy of a world beyond your control. We have some core needs like feeling connected, feeling valued, feeling secured, feeling like we are making a difference in the world, feeling like we have autonomy, and to feel like we're doing good at something. Materialism forces you into chasing a life that does a bad job at meeting those needs. In our consumerist society, where we are bombarded with messages that we constantly need things like money and status to be happy, there's a massive gap between what your true needs are as a human being and what society tells you that you need. This chapter also talks about how advertising makes us more materialistic and has some interesting studies. Take this Canadian experiment from 1976, for example. This experiment consisted of two groups of 4 to 5 year olds. Group A was not shown any commercials, while Group B was shown commercials for a particular toy. The two groups were then introduced to two boys. One of the boys had a toy while the other didn't. They could play with one of these two boys and were told that the boy with the toy is not a very nice boy. He's mean. The results showed that the children who had seen the commercial were more likely to play with the boy with the toy, even though he was presented as mean. We see a lot more commercials today. Well, in fact, 18-month-old kids can recognize the M in McDonald's rather than the letters in their own last names. By the time they are 36 months old, they can recognize over 100 brand logos. Tim Kasser also found a correlation between the amount of time spent on advertising and the rise of more materialistic values between the years 1976 to 2003. Many ads are framed in a negative way that makes people feel inadequate, and in these ads, the product being sold is seen as the solution to that inadequacy. There's a whole body of research on this. For instance, one study found that negative ads induce impulse buys. Chapter 9 focuses on Dr. Vincent Felitti, who was an expert in treating obesity, who made some interesting discoveries about trauma and how it causes depression. He came out with novel nutritional plans that would help his patients drastically lose weight. However, many of his patients would suddenly gain the weight back. Felitti decided to investigate this phenomenon. He asked one of his patients about when she first began to put on weight, and she replied that it started when she was 11. The doctor asked her if anything in particular happened at that age when she was alone. She replied that she was raped by her grandfather. The doctor decided to ask his other patients 3 questions. How did you feel when you lost weight? When in your life did you start putting on weight? What else happened around that time? He asked these questions to over 183 of his patients. He found that over 55% of his patients had been sexually assaulted. Many of the men reported severely traumatic experiences compared to the average population as well. There were 3 main reasons why people would actually become obese. The first reason was women felt sexually protected when they gained weight. The overweight women felt safer as men wouldn't find them as attractive. They'd often state how when they lost weight, more men would hit on them, and this would make them uncomfortable. The second reason was because they felt that the extra weight protected them from physical harm. The book gives examples of 2 prison guards who felt more vulnerable after losing 100 to 150 pounds. The third reason was because it lowered people's expectations. They often felt stressed out by society's needs. And some of the interviewees would state how in jobs or job interviews, people would just assume they're lazy because they're fat. Dr. Felitti decided to present his findings at a medical conference. One doctor stood up and said that his patients were just making up stories of sexual abuse to provide a cover for their failed lives. Felitti was horrified by this response and decided to gather some scientific data. He teamed up with Dr. Robert Anda, who was part of the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the CDC in Atlanta. Anda had studied self-destructive behaviors and their link to traumatic experiences. Anda and Felitti got their funding from the CDC for the ACE study, also called the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. The study was in the form of a questionnaire and was given to over 17,000 individuals. Here are some of the results of the ACE study. For every category of traumatic experience, you were more likely to be depressed and anxious. Each category was equal to 1 point, and there were 8 categories in total. If you had 6 categories or 6 points, you were 5 times more likely to become depressed than someone who didn't have any ACEs. If you had 7 categories of ACEs, you were 3,100% more likely to commit suicide as an adult. A dose response effect was observed. In other words, the more categories of trauma someone experienced, the worse their health outcomes would be. Emotional abuse was the type of ACE that was most likely to cause depression, even higher than sexual abuse. No one wanted to believe it, including the CDC, but the study was replicated with similar results and is now gaining traction. In 2020, a study reported the ACE scores of over 200,000 adults from across 37 states. The data was pulled from the CDC's Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which is also called the BRFSS. The BRFSS collects state data about U.S. residents regarding their health-related risks, behaviors, chronic health conditions, and use of preventive services through telephone surveys. The results were shocking. 58% of the population had at least one adverse childhood experience. Many doctors and psychologists had been presenting depression as an irrational malfunction of your genes or your brain. During his interview with Johann, Dr. Folletti said that depression is a normal response to abnormal life experiences and said that the medical establishment doesn't like this idea because for them it's still very comforting to think it's all happening due to changes in the brain. He was quoted as saying, "Medications do have a role. Are they the be all and end all? No. Are they shortchanging people? Yes." With these facts in mind, Folletti approached the problem in a different way. He set up support groups for obese people where they could discuss the real reasons why they overate and talk about what they had been through. He found that patients now had better and longer lasting outcomes. Dr. Anda said, when people have these kind of problems, it's time to stop asking what's wrong with them and instead ask what happened to them. This chapter talks about how depression can be caused because we feel disrespected and when our status is threatened. This chapter opens with Robert Sapolsky's research into baboons. Robert Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinology researcher from Stanford who spent 20 years researching stress levels in baboons. Baboons have a very hierarchical social system that involves constant conflict between the chief baboon and those on the bottom. The baboons at the bottom would start losing their hair, get constantly beaten up, and would curl up and walk with their heads bowed down. Sapolsky would tranquilize the baboons, extract their blood, and analyze cortisol levels in their blood. He found that baboons would be most stressed in 2 situations, when their status was threatened and when their status is low. He published his findings in the Scientific American in a paper titled Stressed in the Wild, and many scientists wondered if a similar pattern could be observed in humans. The British psychologist Paul Raymond Gilbert said that depression could be a submission response similar to what we see in baboons who are stressed because their status is threatened. For instance, just like the baboons, we often use words like "I feel down" or "I feel weighed down" to describe depression. Unequal societies have higher levels of depression. Johann Hari then mentions the research of British epidemiologists Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. They would study inequalities' effects on mental health and found that the more unequal a society, mental illness rises, and just like baboons, humans at the top fear falling down while those at the bottom feel useless. They would talk about this extensively in the popular book the spirit level, why more equal societies always do better. The 11th chapter in Lost Connections talks about how we're becoming increasingly disconnected from nature and compares modern urban life to animals in captivity versus in the wild. It also cites research that found that people who live in greener areas report higher levels of well being, and another one that found mental illness was less prevalent in poor neighborhoods that were greener. A point to note here is that higher levels of poverty correlates with higher levels of depression. This chapter talks about how and why the lack of a secure future causes us to feel depressed. Michael Chandler was a researcher at the University of British Columbia who found that suicides are significantly higher in half of all First Nations tribes in Canada. When he started researching this, he found that tribes that are more independent or have more control of their community have less suicide than tribes that rely on the Canadian government. Extremely depressed individuals can't see a future. Michael Chandler also spent some time researching institutionalized teens. He divided them into two groups. One group consisted of anorexics, and the other group consisted of suicidal teens, and he asked them to read comic books. It's important to note that the anorexics did not suffer from depression as a comorbidity. Once the two groups read the comic books, he would ask them to imagine what would happen to some characters in the future. Would they be the same person? For instance, he did it with the Christmas Carol story written by Charles Dickens and asked the participants what would happen to the main character Scrooge. He found that depressed teens would struggle to answer how they or these characters would be in the future. In essence, they could not see a future ahead of them. The gig economy and its ramifications. In this part of the chapter, Johann focuses on how our current neoliberal system is causing many people to feel hopeless about the future. He mentions a personal anecdote of a friend from university who was struggling to find jobs because she was overqualified. She would find herself in the same trap that many young graduates find themselves in today's job market, which is that jobs need experience, but no one was willing to hire her so that she could get that experience. She found herself stuck in terrible, high stress, low paying temp jobs. For the past 30 years, many people are stuck in this position. Around 20% of people in the US and Germany have no job contract. He talks about how the middle class has been shrinking. I'm not sure he mentions this in the book, but here are some trends. Wages have stagnated. Adjusted for inflation, the average wage has stagnated in the US. This pattern is being seen in many industrialized countries. Here's a graph from Pew Research that shows both wages adjusted for inflation in the green line and the wages in current dollars in the yellow line. The second problem and trend that we're noticing today is that the price of homes and rent prices have massively outpaced the growth in wages in the US. You may have noticed this in your country as well. Here's a graph from the US Census Bureau, which clearly shows that average home values have widely outpaced median household income since 1970. This gap has been growing wider ever since. 2022 and 2023 have been interesting years as well and have accelerated this trend because not only has inflation skyrocketed, which means that the value of your money has essentially declined by a larger margin, housing prices still haven't dropped, and you don't see people paying less rent than they did before the inflation crisis began. While on the other hand, because of higher interest rates, people have to contend with paying higher mortgages on the houses they own. Usually when the Fed raises the interest rates, prices tend to depreciate. But we're not seeing that. This chapter talks about the role of genes and brain changes in causing depression and dispels many myths about it. Avshalom Caspi was the first scientist to discover that certain genes like 5-HTTP were associated with depression. However, neuroscientists like Robert Sapolsky stated that while some of us are more susceptible to it, we need the right environmental conditions to trigger it. This chapter also talks about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to rewire itself. Being in tough situations changes your brain for the worse. This is especially true for people suffering from PTSD. Bessel van der Kolk, who is a prominent researcher of PTSD, has talked about how this happens in more detail in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. Mark Lewis, who is a developmental psychologist and neuroscientist, explains there are three ways we typically view depression. The first way we look at depression is to see it as a moral failing. For instance, you might hear some people say things like, "Something is wrong with you. Pull yourself up from your bootstraps and fix it." The second way we look at depression is to see it as a malfunction of the brain. According to Dr. Lewis, neither of these methods work as pointed out by the evidence. The third and the least common way we look at depression is to see it as a natural reaction to the way we live today. An experiment conducted in the University of Montgomery showed that believing that depression is just a disease does not reduce your hostility towards a person. In this experiment, you as the participant are taken to a room and told that the experiment was a test designed to see how people learn new information. You meet another participant who is actually an actor. The actor mentions in passing that he has a mental illness, and this is where the experiment splits into two outcomes. In the first outcome, the actor says that the cause of his mental illness is because of a chemical imbalance in his brain. While in the second outcome, the actor says that the cause of his mental illness is because of some bad things that happened to him in his life, like a bad childhood or a traumatic experience. You're then taught to press a bunch of buttons in a pattern and teach it to the actor. If the actor makes a mistake, you're instructed to give him a succession of electric jolts, just enough to cause a little bit of pain instead of seriously maiming him. The actor would just pretend to be hurt because in reality he wasn't getting any electrical zaps. The researchers wanted to find out if there would be a difference in how many times the actor got zapped and how hard the actor was zapped based on what cause he gave to you. The results showed that you were more likely to hurt the actor if you believed that the reason for the actor's mental illness was because of a chemical imbalance compared to you believing something bad happened to him. The status quo in regards to understanding the causes of depression is supposed to be the biopsychosocial model, which states that mental illness is caused due to a variety of biological, psychological, and social factors. However, according to many psychiatrists and scientists like Professor Krummeyer of McGill University, mainstream psychology has shifted towards the biological, even though people pay lip service to the biopsychosocial model. We have ended with a grossly oversimplified picture of depression that doesn't look at social factors, but at a deeper level, for me, doesn't look at basic human processes. Professor Krummeyer also explains why mainstream psychology has shifted to this model. One reason why that is because it's more politically challenging to say that so many people are feeling terrible because of how our societies work. It fits much more with our system of neoliberal capitalism. Okay, we'll get you functioning more efficiently, but please don't start questioning because that's going to destabilize a lot of things. The other key reason is the pharmaceutical industry. Companies are major forces shaping a lot of psychiatry. It's this big business with billions of dollars that pay the bills, So they largely set the agenda, and they obviously want our pain to be seen as a chemical problem with a chemical solution. The result is that we've ended up becoming a culture with a distorted view of our own distress. The fact that the entire program of psychiatric research should look like this is really depressing. Johann interviews Rufus May, a British clinical psychologist best known for using his own experiences of being a psychiatric patient to promote alternative recovery approaches for those experiencing psychotic symptoms to explain the ramifications of this current approach as opposed to psychosocial model. He says, telling people that their distress is primarily due to a biological malfunction does several damaging things to a person. The first thing is you leave the person feeling disempowered and feeling like they are not good enough because their brain is not good enough. The second thing is that it pitches us against parts of ourselves. And the third thing it tells you is that your distress has no meaning. It's just defective tissue. But I think we're depressed for good reasons. Dr. May actively follows this methodology and ends his interview by quoting Jiddu Krishnamurti. Quote, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. End quote. After this chapter, the book moves on to talking about potential solutions. Making yourself happy doesn't work. In the West, the common advice people hear when they're depressed is to make yourself happy. But this doesn't work. According to a University of Berkeley study, if you deliberately try to make yourself happier, then you won't be happy. The study found that in countries where people are less individualistic, people felt less depressed because the way they viewed happiness was community oriented, like helping others, versus self oriented, which is making yourself happy. The Amish, for instance, have a strong community orientation and report significantly lower levels of depression compared to the average population. However, Johann raises a counterpoint. Amish women are subordinate to men, gays are not tolerated, and individuality is in a way pushed down for the sake of the community. My personal opinion is that living in a highly tribal society can be detrimental to innovation and strong ego development. You can be individualistic and altruistic and create a meaningful and purposeful life whereby you feel like you're contributing positively to your community and society as a whole without feeling that your individuality is being diminished for the sake of conformity. This chapter offers another solution to depression caused by loneliness, which is called social prescribing. Social prescribing is an approach that connects people to different activities, groups, and services in their community to meet practical social and emotional needs that affect their health and well being. It was first tried by the NHS in England. The reason why social prescribing might work is that it gives participants a sense of shared purpose. For instance, the book gave an example of how depressed and anxious people who shared a love for nature chose building a garden as their form of social prescribing. This resulted in them becoming closer to each other and led to their depressive symptoms reducing and even fading away. Johann also states that a lot of studies also found that therapeutic horticulture was effective in depression and anxiety. This chapter proposes the idea of workplace democracy as a solution to the lack of meaningful work and cites a major study by Cornell University that analyzed 320 companies. In this study, half of the companies had top-down control and the other half let the workers set a democratic agenda. The study found that businesses that were closer to the democratic model grew 4 times more. This chapter talks about a study by Tim Kasser that examined three longitudinal studies and an intervention as a potential solution to the problem of junk values. Studies 1, 2, and 3 examine how changes in materialistic aspirations related to changes in well being, using three varying timescales: 12 years, 2 years, and 6 months. Across all three studies, results supported the hypothesis that people's well being improves as they place relatively less importance on materialistic goals and values, whereas people who were more materialistic tended to have lower levels of well being over time. The fourth study showed that highly materialistic American teenagers who received an intervention that decreased materialism also experienced increases in self esteem over the next several months relative to a control group. This chapter talks about how experiences that help us to transcend our egos can be a great way to heal depression. Sympathetic joy is feeling happy for other people and is the opposite of jealousy and envy. This can be done through sympathetic joy meditation. The point of sympathetic joy is not only to feel less envy of other people, but more importantly, to see the happiness of others not as a rebuke but as a source of joy for yourself. Johann mentions a brief history of the use of psychedelics in the 50s and 60s to treat depression and, for instance, the use of LSD to treat alcoholism, and introduces Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins, who conducted the first experiments since the 60s when psychedelic research completely stopped. In the first experiment, 80% of the participants who received the highest dose reported that it was one of five of the most important things that had ever happened to them after they were interviewed 2 months after the experiment. A large majority of the participants also reported positive attitudes about themselves, others, and life, and they also became more compassionate. In another experiment by Roland, psilocybin was administered to long-term smokers to see if it helped them to quit smoking. 80% of the participants quit smoking even after 6 months had passed since the experiment. After 12 months, that number stayed relatively high at 67%, or over two-thirds of the participants. During the follow-up, 12 months later, 86% of the participants also noted that this was amongst the top 5 meaningful experiences in their lives. Johann also interviewed the team at University College London that was conducting experiments with psilocybin, which was showing promising results. A common experience amongst participants was a feeling akin to ego death, where they feel like they transcend the ego and also report feelings of a oneness with everything. Johann believes that there are two catches when it comes to using psychedelics to treat depression and anxiety. The first one is that while a lot of people find it liberating to be free from their ego, approximately 25% in the Johns Hopkins study found it to be terrifying. The goal in the long term isn't to annihilate the ego, but to help us to return to a healthier relationship with our egos. In order for that to happen, people need to feel like they're in a safe space with people they can trust, according to Bill Richards, who pursued psychotherapy research with LSD, DPT, MDA, and psilocybin at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. The second catch is that after someone has this extraordinary experience where materialism and status seems so shallow, and where people feel an immense sense of connection to all things, people find it hard to return to a world that prioritizes this connection and materialism, and the insights gained from these experiences can't be maintained in the way our society currently operates, which leads to some people feeling depressed. Dr. Folletti, who found a link between depression and trauma, also found how compassion can help these people. He discovered this by designing an experiment where every doctor at his center was to provide all their patients a trauma questionnaire. These patients could be suffering from any ailment, whether physical or mental. If a patient suffered from childhood trauma, the doctors were given two simple instructions. The first instruction was to be sympathetic towards the patients. For instance, they would say, I see you had to survive X, Y, or Z in your childhood. I'm sorry that happened to you. It shouldn't have happened. Would you like to talk about those experiences? The second instruction was to ensure their patients didn't feel judged. The results showed that 1 month later, patients who had their trauma compassionately acknowledged by an authority figure showed significant improvements in their symptoms and were 35% less likely to return for medical help for any condition. This is an important finding because people with trauma tend to underplay their trauma for many reasons, which includes being ridiculed for taking the courage to even talk about it. In my personal experience, men are more prone to be ridiculed, which forces them to keep their trauma hidden, even from themselves. So please be a decent human being and try to be compassionate to people who share a traumatic story with you. If you're someone who's suffering from depression and also suffer from traumatic experiences, please discuss this with your mental health professional. This chapter proposes universal basic income, or UBI, as a solution to the problem of a lack of a secure future. Johann points out several studies on UBI, with the first one being an experiment conducted in Manitoba in the 70s. A researcher found that hospital separations declined 8.5% amongst subjects relative to controls during the experimental period. Accident and injury codes and mental health codes were most responsible for the decline. This researcher also interviewed people who took part in this experiment in Manitoba. The researcher told the author that, based on her interviews, that this UBI was done in a very poor town in Manitoba, and the extra money meant a lot of the people didn't live paycheck to paycheck, found hobbies, or used the time to get a degree and improve their wealth, which Johann thinks contributed positively to the health of the community. Johann cites a study by an epidemiologist who found that Americans with an income of less than $20,000 were found to be more likely to develop depression, as well as to make an argument for UBI. Johann also points out another intervention that was carried out on a Cherokee tribe in North Carolina called the Great Smoky Mountain Study. This was a longitudinal study that followed over 1,200 tribespeople for over 10 years. In this study, everyone in the tribe would earn a share of profits from a nearby casino that was built on their land, which was about $4,000 per person. The results showed that behavioral problems in children, like ADHD and childhood depression, fell by 40%. The final chapter of Lost Connection starts off with Johann circling back to the three categories in which all the major causes of depression can be put under, which are biological, psychological, and social. These three comprise of the biopsychosocial model of mental health. Johann argues that the social and psychological aspects have been ignored for far too long and provides evidence for his conclusion. The WHO summarized the evidence well in 2011 when they said, mental health is produced socially. The presence or absence of mental health is above all a social indicator and therefore requires social as well as individual solutions. He also points out the UN's official statement for World Health Day in 2017, which states that the dominant biomedical narrative of depression is based on the biased and selective use of research outcomes that cause more harm than good, undermine the right of health, and must be abandoned. There is a growing evidence base that there are deeper causes of depression, so while there is some role for medications, we need to stop using them. And We need to move from focusing on chemical imbalances to focusing on power imbalances. The last chapter is very powerful, and I recommend people to pick up the book because Johann has some very powerful things to say, not only throughout the book, but especially in this last chapter.